If you're a filmmaker, you know shooting on 16mm film is expensive, and you also know that getting a convincing film look on your digital footage is very challenging. But with a plugin called Dehancer, you just might be able to get something super convincing. So let's take a look at this plugin and compare it to 16mm, 8mm, and 35mm film, incorporate it into some VFX compositing, and see if we get something that looks convincing. Full disclaimer, Dehancer did give me a license to use their plugin in exchange for this review, but they didn't stipulate that I had to say anything specific, so what you're about to see is 100% my opinion. I've been using Dehancer for about a month now. I've been using it with my Fujifilm X-S20 and F-Log2 footage, some old GoPro, drone, and iPhone footage. And I used Dehancer as part of a VFX project I was working on for a music video that's shot on film. Since I've been using it for about this much time, I do have some strong opinions, so let's get started. I'm gonna start this review with my first impressions of using Dehancer. Then I'm going to take some video footage I shot on my Fujifilm camera and try to match it to Kodak 500T 16mm film from an old film project, Ektachrome 100D Super 8mm film, and a roll of Ektar 100 35mm still film. Dehancer is a film emulation tool to give video footage an analog film look. It has dozens of motion picture and photographic film profiles, realistic grain, halation, and bloom. You can also push and pull the film. You can add film damage, film breath, which sort of flickers color temperature, gate weave, which creates some wiggle, and overscanning, which shows you film sprockets. You can choose Rec 709 if you're using this over color-corrected footage, or you can choose a camera setting and use all the raw or log data in your clip to fine-tune the look. You can adjust settings to mimic Super 8, 16mm, 35mm, and 65mm film presets, and also customize settings as well to dial in something specific. You can use Dehancer in DaVinci Resolve, Adobe Premiere and After Effects, Final Cut Pro, Photoshop and Lightroom for photo editing, and there's an iPhone app. I'm using it in Premiere and After Effects, and I'm using version 7.1.1. My first reactions to using Dehancer were that it was a little bit confusing. There is a little bit of a learning curve. There are so many settings that do very specific things. Playing around with the plugin wasn't getting me very far. So instead, I had to go to Dehancer's website and see what every slider did. One thing this plugin seemed to do better than most is the halation. Halation is a glow that occurs on film. Film has 3 color-sensitive layers, blue, green, and red. If light is particularly bright, it can travel through all 3 layers, then bounce back onto the red layer, which is on the bottom. This creates a red glow around highlights. Film stocks can have an anti-halation or remjet layer to reduce this, but if you've ever shot on Cinestill 800T film, for example, the remjet is removed to encourage halation. But halation is more than just a red glow around highlights. It's most noticeable where the highlight borders a dark part of the frame. Here are some examples of that occurring on this Ektachrome Super 8 footage I shot a few years ago. And Dehancer does a fantastic job of mimicking this. Initially, I thought the halation looked good, but I thought it was something I could replicate on my own, which I had been doing in VFX before. So I decided to do a test, use Dehancer to check out the halation and my own version of halation by blurring the red channel, and the results were night and day. I thought I was doing a good job mimicking halation, but I wasn't. Whatever alchemy is going on here with the halation is working very well. My other first reaction is that there are a ton of film stocks and film looks, and I really wanted to see what they looked like. Their website has some reference frames for some, but not all of them, and I really just want a place to look so I can really quickly see what each film stock looks like without having to go one by one to find something that I like. For the most part, I'm going to be reusing the same 3 or 4, so I know what to go for, but you never know when you want to create a unique or specific look, and it would be helpful to get inspired by some visuals, whether that's thumbnails in the plugin itself, which could be cumbersome, I don't know, or even a solid reference page on their website would be super helpful. If you use the Dehancer app on your phone, it does have previews of all of the film stocks. Now let's try to use Dehancer to match actual film. I have this scan of a 16mm Kodak 500T film from one of my student films. And I also have this footage that I shot on my Fujifilm X-S20 using F-Log2. I tried to recreate the shot as best I could and the lighting, which was super even, tungsten balanced light. My goal is to use Dehancer to mimic film stocks as best I can. While the lighting isn't a perfect match because I only had a single LED panel instead of bouncing an open face on a white ceiling, the results are pretty close. I had to use a few iterations of Lumetri to get everything to match more accurately, but for a quick test, I'm pretty happy with the results. Dehancer has some test footage on their blog of matching Kodak film with cinema cameras. They did the whole camera test on the same day with the same lighting conditions, which is a much more accurate test. And if you look at that, it's near identical, but I'm still happy with the results I got. I also shot a couple rolls of Ektachrome 100D Super 8mm film, so let's see if we can also mimic that look. The Super 8 footage was a little more challenging to match than the 16mm footage. It was mostly all underexposed, which didn't help. I used this footage from London because the overcast skies I think are most similar to New York City in the winter. The Super 8 footage also had this blue halation occurring. I don't know if that was a lens issue or something in the film, but it wasn't immediately replicable with Dehancer. Still, I could get it looking fairly close. This sunset footage was a bit easier to replicate. And I really like these backlit sunset shots. One thing I noticed is that adding Super 8 effects looked really good on this handheld GoPro footage. I think this was a GoPro 1. And I think part of the reason it looks so convincing is because the way I'm shooting it, just pointing the camera, using bright daylight, kind of getting whatever I get, feels more akin to shooting on Super 8. The footage itself feels like one of those in the moment kind of shots you would see in old Super 8mm film. So one takeaway here is that the way you shoot your footage plays a very important role in the desired effect at the end. Recently, I shot a roll of Ektar 100 35mm film, and while this is comparing apples to oranges a little bit, I really loved how those shots turned out, so let's see if I can recreate that look here with Dehancer. It's only 100 ISO, so there wasn't a lot of grain, and there weren't any film artifacts like halation and stuff like that. So this was really just about adding the Ektar 100 film setting in Dehancer, and then adding Lumetri to get all of the midtones, highlights, and shadows to match the film. And it looks pretty good. Some shots are better than others just based on the lighting condition and exposure and camera settings of the footage itself. But I really like the look, and I'm glad that I had the actual film to reference it. Overall, Dehancer gets us really close, but it does need tweaking. It's not a simple drag and drop approach, but I also don't think that's the point of the plugin. There are so many specific things we can tailor and adjust. If you're an editor or a colorist, you know that all brand of digital camera has its own nuance to log footage, and in this case, you do have to account for that. In addition, whatever kind of scan the 16mm film received also affects what it looks like and what I'm comparing. So for example, the 16mm footage has a much better scan than the Super 8 footage. I'm trying to match the scans exactly and then add an adjustment layer on top of both to get something that looks properly color balanced and has the right contrast. One of the biggest strengths of Dehancer is incorporating it into a color grade workflow with your log footage. All of the camera presets are super helpful to get started, and then from there, you can tailor the film look however you want. Using Dehancer on these Fujifilm presets, for example, I still am able to take advantage of the dynamic range of the log footage to really fine-tune the exposure and other adjustments that I might need to get a good look. Taking advantage of the dynamic range of your log footage is going to make it look more like film because film also has a high dynamic range. Dehancer works okay as like a look put on top of Rec. 709 footage. There's really only so much latitude you have with this kind of footage. For GoPro and drone footage, for example, blacks can clip super easily and whites might already be super blown out, so there's only so much latitude you have with your adjustments. For iPhone footage, it actually works pretty well with your HLG footage. And I bet if you have a newer iPhone and you're shooting ProRes log, you can get a really good result. I recently did a VFX project for a music video that was shot on 16mm film. I did 3D renders in Blender and some tracking in After Effects, and used Dehancer as part of the composite to get that 3D render to match the film itself. The music video was shot on Vision 3 500T, but I found that the 50D matched a little better. That was because in my 3D render, I was trying to match the white balance and color of the scan, and basically had to reverse engineer some color. The halation and film profiles actually looked pretty good. I will say that Dehancer in After Effects was super slow. Even with a ton of RAM dedicated to After Effects, I couldn't watch anything in real time. Though this isn't really a knock on Dehancer and more of just the reality of After Effects lately. Over the last few years, as you probably know, After Effects has required so much RAM it is nearly impossible to watch anything real time, especially when you're doing VFX with 4K footage. If I were to shoot a project digitally and try to recreate a film look and I was adding VFX to that project, Dehancer I think would definitely be part of that workflow. I would need to do a lot more testing to see where in the process Dehancer can be added. Is it in the VFX compositing phase? Do you do all of your VFX to a flat log color profile and then add it at the end? I'm not sure with all of these quick tests, but it is an exciting and powerful tool. Here are some tips and tricks I figured out while using Dehancer that helped me get a more convincing film look. Digital footage is incredibly sharp, and when you look at the 16mm film, for example, it's a lot softer than the digital counterpart, so adding a little bit of a Gaussian blur before Dehancer helps create something that looks a little bit more like film. It softens the edges, makes it look a little bit more imperfect, and really gives it that film feel. That also helps soften the halation and glow. Another thing that softens that halation and glow is a quarter black diffusion filter on your lens. I put this on my Fujifilm camera, and it really helps soften where the halation starts and stops instead of it being just like an abrasive chunk of red glow in certain areas. The effect is subtle, which I liked, but I found that it did make enough of a difference that I keep that filter on my camera. Another thing you can do, especially if you're going for a Super 8 look, is to add a posterized time effect and set it to 24 or 18 frames per second just to get the motion looking more accurate. And finally, have a reference. Being able to reference actual 16mm film is super helpful to get a convincing look. I think if you just had your footage, you could get somewhere that you think looks really good, but when you're actually comparing the two, there's so many small details like where the halation is occurring, maybe where there's some green in the midtones and shadows that you weren't expecting, and also just the overall softness of the footage itself that can really help you get a convincing look. Overall, I think this is definitely the most powerful film emulation tool that I've tried. A lot of other film emulation tools are looks that you put on top of your footage, and they do kind of recreate the contrast and color profiles of different film stocks. A lot of them also have grain and damage and all of the other elements that you think you need in film. Where Dehancer really takes it to the next level, in my opinion, is with the halation tool. I haven't really seen any other tool tackle halation in the very specific way it occurs when shooting on film, and Dehancer does that. And I think with enough testing, you could probably shoot something digitally and give it a really convincing 16mm film look. I have a feature film in the works right now, And I was, of course, toying with the idea of what if I shot this on film, and then I looked into the cost and it was outrageous. But now that I have used Dehancer and gotten to know it a little bit more, I'm actually gonna do some camera tests and see if it's possible to mimic a film look for an indie feature and see if that is worthwhile. This includes what we shoot and also all of the VFX as well.